Hey Hawk, how are you? Oh, wow. God, I saw that email. Um, Good. I'm looking forward to being done with school for a little bit, and then I can.
Education. I've been a teacher for a long time. For me, it's to refresh my quantitative data research skills and getting an introduction to the blog writing, as well as being very interested in geriatrics and neuroplasticity, given the RPG opportunity for seniors at different ages. I do have two boys at home. One is 17 and one is 20. I tried to kind of pull them in, but not interested at this point. I'm a little bit slow, and thanks to Hawk, I mean very slow because I've been moving too. I don't have service yet, so I'm using my phone, and so I'm in the process of getting, I'm a substitute teacher right now, and so among other things, doing a lot of things, probably just like you. And so it's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of this group.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you here.
Yeah,
by the
thank
way,
you.
if you're using your phone, do you have it set to audio only so you don't use up your video bandwidth?
Audio, yes, I'm on my phone. I don't see the video for right now. And actually, I have to troubleshoot my volume. I don't know why my volume is not kicking in.
No, we can hear you fine. We can hear you just fine. What I'm saying is, are you on Wi-Fi or are you using your cellular service?
I use my cellular service, but I have unlimited, so I'm okay.
Well, okay. Who's your provider?
T-Mobile.
Yeah, it's not truly unlimited. After a certain point, it'll slow down. They won't shut you off, but it'll slow down after a certain point, depending on your package. So, what you want to do is, have you installed the Jitsi app, or are you doing this through the web browser?
I did install the Jitsi.
Okay, good. So you're in the Jitsi app. So there's an option. There's a button or a setting you can say run as audio only.
Oh, okay.
Use that feature so that you don't see our video, and it'll save you a ton of bandwidth.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to get out of this probably, and then I'm going to go through Jitsi then. Thank you.
Okay, great. We'll see you
shortly. I'll join in a bit.
Great.
Bye. Okay.
Yeah, Ian, if you're ever using Jitsi over your phone, if you're not on Wi-Fi, install the Jitsi app and go audio only, because it will chew through your bandwidth really fast. Getting everything dialed in here. Things still aren't quite right. There it is. Okay. Hello. Welcome, welcome.
But this is a video.
Yeah, now it's video. You want to use audio only.
Yeah, and so I don't see the settings. Okay, here we go. I'm gonna get out of here again. Okay.
Welcome back.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I'm in.
All right, excellent. Okay. So first things first. Now, Ian, have you been to one meeting before and that's it, or how many meetings have you been to now?
Yeah, I went to one meeting last week.
Okay, and what do you recall from that meeting? As far as what we covered, I mean, it was probably more administrative for you since you were new, but we went over various topics. Ian? Hello, Ian.
I am here.
Yeah, I hear you, Daniela.
Yeah, sorry, I was having some connectivity issues.
Okay. By the way, if you're having trouble, if it starts acting up, you can refresh your browser, and sometimes that kind of clears up the cache from time to time.
Oh.
So, Ian, what do you recall from?
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah. So, besides administrative stuff, what do you recall from our last meeting?
I'm trying to see if I can find my notes on it.
Good. Glad to hear you took notes.
Yeah, we talked about I think the biggest thing I remember was the hierarchy of needs by Maslow. We talked about that a little bit, how it steps up.
How it's a hierarchy and not a pyramid.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though all the textbooks teach it as a pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
Daniele, are you familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs? It's pretty low level basic psychology 101 stuff.
Yes, I am on it. I know.
Yeah. So what's interesting is how most textbooks and places teach that as a pyramid.
Yes.
Well, it turns out Maslow is disappointed because until more recent years, for the first 30 plus years that he proposed it, nobody bothered to test it for validity or anything. They just kind of accepted it and swallowed it whole, and he was quite disappointed by that. But secondarily, he did not present it as a pyramid. He presented it as a hierarchy, and the pyramid approach doesn't really fit his theoretical description appropriately, and yet most of the textbooks out there show a pyramid, which is interesting. So we were just debunking a few misconceptions that people have out there, and we'll be doing that periodically here and there where it's relevant. What else do you remember, Ian?
You talked about the 2020 Researchers Conference, and we talked about, since it was just me and you, we talked about little bit more about the requirements of being a researcher.
Okay, good. So yeah, Daniela, I don't know if I already told you, we are planning a research conference in the fall of 2020 next year.
Okay.
Somewhere between it'll be over at Eastern Washington University. Professor Emily Messina, who's the head of the therapeutic recreation department there, she's also on the RPG research board. And she offered to try to help us get resources to run a research conference there at the university.
Nice.
So she's getting back to us on what what it's going to cost, how we can reserve space, and we're going to start planning. So rpgconference.com is where those updates will be as it comes together.
Okay.
And so somewhere between August and October is where we're thinking it will happen. Probably more on the August side because doing it once school starts, it's harder to get facilities. So while school is out for the summer, it's easier to use their facilities at a lower rate. We're hoping to get outside of RPG Research, the organization. We're hoping to bring in hopefully at least 10 different speakers from around the world on the latest, role-playing game research. That's our hope. I've talked to different people initially, and to really come down to the final date and everything else, as far as who can actually make it. But I've spoken about a dozen researchers around the world who said they would be definitely interested. Part of the goal of the conference is that when I started the RPG Research Project in 2004, there was very little out there. There were maybe 40 studies, 40, 50, 60 studies, most of them just used to disprove the negative stereotypes, and very few that were even remotely causal. They were mostly correlative and some case studies and anecdotes and things like that. And then just a smidgen of a little more substantial research. The other thing was I was running into people when I would speak at conferences and elsewhere who said they were a therapist or they knew a therapist who was using role-playing games in their practice, but they never shared their experiences, challenges, results, data, anything with anybody. There was no publications. There was nothing on the web. This is 2004. And again, I started researching all of this back in 1983 when there were maybe 2 studies at the time, right? There was almost nothing back then. I did an 8-page research report essay back there in 83. So going from just a handful to 40 to 60 was an improvement, but it still wasn't that great. So the RPG Research Project, one of the several goals, but one of the big goals is to find and develop, causal data over time when possible. Yes. But my biggest concern at that time was, nobody's talking to each other. There's no central interface for people, for the community. There was no community really. So I set up the RPG Research website back in 04, 06 to be a community where all of us could come together and share. And that worked. It slowly everybody found the site. We all started talking to each other. We were on the forums, we were in the chat rooms, and we all were starting to share our experiences and data. And that was going really well. Basically, anybody who was doing research in role-playing games I was talking to, they were talking to me, I was talking to them, and I was introducing everybody to each other. And that was going great. Everybody was very open and sharing. Then about 2016, 2017, I think people started seeing dollar signs. Some people started seeing opportunities for making some money. And I started seeing, especially in academia, but also in private practice, more people starting to break into separate cliques and silos. And unfortunately, since about 2017, so that communication rapidly, people started to go off and do their own things. And now we're kind of back. There's a lot more awareness now, and the research is getting better, and that's great. But a lot of people now are kind of hoarding their data. And my hope is with this conference that we can get people back to that more sharing approach, because it'll be in that style of a conference. A number of these people speak at fandom conferences or conferences specific to their profession. But the problem with fandom conferences is those places don't really want research and hard data. They just want to hear them using anecdotes and be entertained. And then the specialty conferences, from their specific discipline, they're all broken into their different discipline silos. And the RPG conference is meant to be a multi-interdisciplinary conference, on the same research area, but from all different disciplines and perspectives. So that's what will hopefully be distinctive. Now, there are game research conferences out there. This will be a little narrower in scope. We want to keep it to role-playing games specifically because while there's lots of research on games in general, the research on role-playing games, we really need to get that boosted and get everybody talking to each other and sharing data so that we can make more progress. What's happened since the fracturing is people are now repeating the same mistakes from 20 years ago. I'm running into people who they're approaching all this like it's brand new, like it's the first time that anybody's ever done research on it. I mean, they literally are publishing, we're the first people to research this. They're literally posting that in their new journals and stuff like that. And I'm like, what are you talking about? This has been going on for decades. So I'm hoping we can get everybody talking to each other again. And so that's what I hope the conference will help with. And that's why we call it the RPG conference rather than the RPG research conference, even though it is a research conference. Because RPG research has a brand identity, I don't want people to think it's only about us. It's meant to be about everybody coming in. And that's why we want to bring in 10 speakers from outside of our organization, RPG Research, on the topic. Now, if we don't get all 10, we'll live, but that's our goal. In addition to our own staff. So it also can be a reunion, for our RPG Research staff that are scattered around the world. This would be a great opportunity for them to come to town and we get to meet each other in person and such, because we have people all over the country, South America, Europe, Middle East, Greater Asia, etc. So that will hopefully also just be and it's meant to be, it would start on a Friday evening, go all day Saturday, and then wrap up Sunday early afternoon.
Nice.
Yeah, so because in talking to people, it's not worth it to them to fly all the way out from the other end of the world if it's only a one-day conference or something.
That's right.
Yeah, but if we do it too early on Friday, most people can't make the early sessions because they have to get off work or their flights arrive. And then if we make it too late on Sunday, they need to catch their flights out of town. So I've run a lot of conventions and conferences. And so starting Friday evening, like 6 p.m. or so, is usually a good starting point. And then running all day Saturday, packing it in like from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. And then Sunday morning until about 2 or 3 or 4 in the afternoon. And then everybody can go catch their flights. That's a pretty good schedule for pretty good attendance numbers. So we will see how that goes, and I'll keep you posted. So that's what Ian was mentioning there. What else do you remember, Ian?
Like a lot of at the beginning of the conference, you were talking about how we're trying to make moves to, like with a contact list with the prison facilities.
Yes.
We were basically assign them to different people in different states, have them contact, find out if they're punitive or rehab centric.
All right.
And about sending letters to those facilities about getting more programs in them.
Yeah, so we still got to work on that. So Daniela, one of our big research projects right now is the latest status on the bans against role-playing games in prisons throughout the U.S.
No, that's a good cause. I like that.
Yeah, so most prisons have an outright ban. A handful of them, people have made inroads and gotten programs to be allowed, but they're like maybe 3 or 4 places. So we want to build on that and try to contact, as many throughout the country and try to turn that around during this new year, next year. Part of the purpose being is we want to go in and do, a combination of our community programs and a combination of some research studies. And then over time, see what the recidivism rate is. Now, general research shows that incarcerated populations that participate in creative programs, so there are theater and improv programs, there are creative writing programs, there are, various programs like that, range between 40 to 80% of them will not reoffend after discharge.
Nice.
So that's pretty good numbers. Considering the reoffend rate, the recidivism rate for prison population is pretty darn high. Those are pretty good numbers. So we can hopefully extrapolate that at the minimum, role-playing gaming would be in that range as another creative program. So we can draw from that as a parallel research. But we don't know, right? There could be something about role-playing gaming that maybe it's worse. Maybe it's terrible, right? I don't think so, but you don't know until you do the research. Or it may be that it does better than some of the other creative programs. We don't know till there's research done. So over the next year or two, we're hoping to build up our knowledge and expertise in this area, share it with everybody, and aggregate all the data we can find related to the topic, get our foot in the door here in Washington State, maybe Idaho and Oregon, try to get some of our volunteer community programs running so that we get some more in-the-field expertise. So not necessarily formal research, but it's part of us learning a topic as we immerse into whatever the topic is. So a couple of years ago, we did a program on role-playing gaming and muscular dystrophy and related disorders. And so we spent more than 6 months preparing to do a program with the Muscular Dystrophy Association with their summer camp. So we ran a couple of days worth of programs there. And we had to learn everything we could about muscular dystrophy and what adaptations need to be made for role-playing gaming, because it involved both LARP and tabletop and such. So it was, we learned a lot from that, and we found out stuff that we never would have thought of. So one of the things that we talked about last week was people had a choice, challenged by choice. They could either participate in the tabletop version or the live action version. Now, keep in mind, are you familiar with the World Health Organization ICF codes, International Classification of Functioning, and ICD, International Classification of Disability codes?
No.
Okay, you'll want to get familiar with those. Those are freely available online through the World Health Organization. So it's ICF, ICD. We use those codes to define a participant's level of functioning or disability. Depending on how you want to look at it. Yeah, ICF and ICD. So ICF is International Classification of Functioning. ICD is International Classification of Disability. And here in the U.S., we also use, of course, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, but that's mostly limited to the U.S., the greater U.S. influence. The rest of the world uses ICF, ICD for everything.
Okay, yeah.
And it's used for insurance purposes. It's used for a lot of reasons. So we use those codes primarily. And one of the things is on the scale of disability, you have a 0 through 4. So a code would be like B2933.2. Now, I'm going to make up what that means because I don't have it memorized. But B means body, so it's a body function thing that we're talking about. 2900 we could say is, let's say, moving their upper body, moving their upper torso. And 32 might say, left arm or something like that. And dot 2 would be the level of impairment or function. So a 0 means no impairment. A 4 means complete impairment. They can't move that limb without, an external device or help or something.
Yes.
And 1 is, mild impairment, 2 is moderate impairment, 3 is severe impairment, and 4 is complete impairment. So I'll let you know that. So when I say on a 0 through 4 scale, now you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So with the Muscular Dystrophy Association program we had more than 20 campers in wheelchairs with various forms of muscular dystrophy. Muscular dystrophy is more than 40 different disorders lumped together. And they all have different pathologies and outcomes. It used to be for certain forms of muscular dystrophy that if you had a diagnosis as a child, you were dead before you hit puberty. Oh. Now those same people with that diagnosis can make it into their 20s and 30s or more. So they're getting to have a little bit more of a life. And thanks to research and everything else. But there's a key principle they found with all the forms of muscular dystrophy, which is use it or lose it. And this is related to neuroplasticity as well.
Yes.
So with the breakdown of the neuromuscular system, one of the things that you can do to slow it down is be more physically and cognitively active. And so these programs the Muscular Dystrophy Association runs tend to be, as much physical and cognitive, push them as much as they can stand. So we were told outright, we want you to exhaust them. We want them to just be so tired, but we want them to keep at it as long as possible. This comes from the whole recreation therapy concept of intrinsic motivation. If people are intrinsically motivated, so not extrinsically, do this and you'll win some money or you win an award. They do it because they love it, right? That's why they're doing it.
Yes.
Why do you hike that mountain? because that's what I like to do. It's not that I get any awards or anything. It's because I just like hiking that mountain. So if you can find activities that people are intrinsically motivated to do, they're much more likely to push through whatever challenges they're dealing with and get a better long-term therapeutic benefit, and their long-term prognosis is usually much better. So we were asked to do live action, but we brought in the tabletop because we were concerned that some of them would not be comfortable. For example, we were going to do boffer LARP. Are you familiar with that term at all?
No.
Okay, so LARP means live action role play, which is different than tabletop role playing. So as you go through your training, you're going to learn the whole history of role playing gaming. Role playing gaming was the first role playing game was published in 1974. There was no such thing as a role playing game, published before 1974, and that was Dungeons and Dragons. That was the first one, and that was a tabletop game, cooperative, verbal. You sit around a table. You verbally share the story, use pencil, paper, and dice, and that's it. A few years later, video game versions, solo adventure books, modules, and live action variants started to develop. And so LARP is now since 2012, is now in the Oxford English Dictionary as its own word. It used to be an acronym, big all 4-letter capitals, but it's now an actual noun, and then the activity out is LARPing, but it's actually a word now since 2012.
Nice. And
there are various forms of LARP, and again, you're going to learn all of this in your studies with the self-paced training. The two main versions would be combat and non-combat, right? Those are really obvious. And another variant is costumed and non-costumed. So there are LARPs that you need to dress up in a costume and try to look whatever the period is that you're trying to be, etc. And there are others you can just show up in your street clothes, doesn't matter what you're wearing. And then there are the combat LARPs, and they range from very soft and very representative to extremely realistic and brutal. And they start to become more like reenactments rather than LARP. Now, the key difference between a LARP and a reenactment in this context is reenactment, generally you're trying to get as much realism as possible, and usually you're reenacting some historical situation. And you generally, unless you're taking on a specific character from history, you have not created a character separate from yourself that develops and evolves and grows and changes over time. You're just taking on the role like an actor in a scene. You're acting. It's more like a scripted theater than a role playing game. LARP, you take on a character of some kind, and you over time hopefully have time to develop it and grow and change. And there's usually statistics as well, although that varies with the LARP. So there's the combat LARP, and then what's known as salon LARP. So salon LARP is something you would more typically do in your house or a building. You don't have to go outdoors and such or need a gym. Combat LARP, you need a gym or a park or something like that. And, a variation of a salon LARP could be like a murder mystery dinner, right? But instead of just being a murder mystery dinner where you're all just yourselves who all of a sudden, it's a pretend mystery and you're there to try to solve the mystery, you're actually going to take on a specific character over time. You're going to be the, Detective Jato, right? Just make up a character who is there to investigate it, and it's going to evolve, and everybody takes on their characters, and they grow and evolve. So it's more than just a dinner murder mystery, but that would be one example of a salon LARP. And you don't need to wear a costume, etc., or some of them you do. But they don't involve combat. They don't generally involve physical contact. There are some LARPs that have simulated sex, like they don't actually have sex, but they have rules for romantic relationships for the characters. So they have characters that maybe the individuals have no interest in each other, but their characters are married and intimate or something in some way. And they have to role play that, and they have to have rules on how to do that. So it's a whole other subculture. One of the best people for information about LARPs is Professor Sarah Lynn Bowman out of Texas. She wrote the book, The Functions of Role-Playing Games. It was her doctoral dissertation. She did a bunch of case studies, I think about 19 individuals in role-playing. But she is really deep into the LARP community worldwide. She goes to Europe all the time. And so she is a wonderful resource on all things LARP. She knows far more about it than I do. I am very strong in tabletop and computer-based and solo adventures. I'm a little weak on the LARP side. I've done it and I do it, but I'm a lightweight in LARP compared to her and many others. But I bring in as much as possible on that. So on the combat side, Boffer LARP is a kind of soft combat where people make weapons that are with a lot of foam padding. So they make this big foam padded sword or this big foam padded lance, things like that. So that when somebody bonks you with it, when they, with the buffer, it doesn't really hurt. You could make it sting a little bit if you hit hard enough, but it's basically like a pillow fight, right?
Okay.
But the point is that they're making contact and they're simulating combat that way. And it's very physical. It's active. So the Muscular Dystrophy Association wanted us to include a Boffer LARP with more than 20 kids in wheelchairs who were at functional levels between 1 through 3. So remember, 0 through 4, 0 no impairment, 4 complete impairment. They were function levels 1 through 3. And so 3 is quite profound impairment. They could barely move maybe one arm, and they had a helper and things like, a lot of challenges. Many of them were intubated, so they're out in the field with, trach tubes, and they want us to do a combat game. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
I was very nervous. So safety. So we spent a lot of months trying to take that, and we were taking a very conservative approach to their safety, whereas the Muscular Dystrophy Association director of all the camps, she was like, and this is Brooke, she was like, no, go for it. They'll be fine. We'll have nurses on hand. We've got a whole battery of nurses. We've got a clinic. We want these kids to be kids, and it's okay to have them roughhouse, and they get hurt a little, it'll be fine. I'm like, oh, man. And I have a little bit of a nursing background, too. So, I was a CNA and an LPN trainee and worked in nursing for a while back in the early 90s. And that I was just scared of all the things that could go wrong.
Yes.
So we worked in a lot of safety features into the LARP. And again, we gave people a choice. They could either choose the tabletop version or the live action version, the LARP version. And we expected it to be a mix. Well, the first day, only one person chose to go straight to tabletop. Everybody else wanted to do the LARP, and which is great. However, and we weren't surprised by this, they got tired, and so then they changed their mind and want to go do the tabletop one. And we were prepared. We expected that. And so after playing for half an hour, they came and joined the tabletop game. Now, the tabletop game was the same story as the live action game. So it was parallel. So as things changed in one, so they could kind of stay in the loop even though they were playing separately. But what we never thought of, this is where doing things in the field helps inform our research, right? Once we get outside the lab and the controls of controlling it, now we're out in the wild, the people throw all kinds of curveballs at you, is then once they kind of recharged a little bit, got their energy back, they went back to the LARP. And then they started this cycle, is over a 3-hour period, of going and do the LARP till they got tired, coming back to tabletop till they recharged, and they went back to the LARP, and they were going back and forth 3, 4, 5, 6 times. Never would have occurred to us. Right? It didn't occur to the MDA folks either. But that kept them going because they were having such a wonderful time, but they got to the point where, they couldn't move their limbs and such. They were just too tired, but they didn't want it to stop, which is, a good kid energy thing. And while they're out, and we have these wonderful photos and video, which we can't show publicly, but we can show, training and such of these kids just having a wonderful time being kids, right? They're forgetting about their disability and just being in the moment, having those opportunities for flow state through their immersion and really pushing themselves and having a great time doing it. So, and then the other day, so later that week we had another day of it, and it was another one, but it was an adventure LARP. So instead of using buffers and having combat, it was go around and, go on a treasure hunt, solve riddles and puzzles and clues, meet different characters that would, you'd interact and ask questions. And at one point they met an Ent. Do you know what an Ent is?
No.
Okay. Familiar at all with J.R.R. Tolkien, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings?
Well, to be honest.
Oh, okay.
No.
Are you familiar with any fantasy literature?
Regarding Lord of the Rings?
No, just any fantasy fiction.
I have to think. I'm very serious, and I'm all scientific based. You know.
Understood. But remember what Einstein said about knowledge and creativity.
I did a little bit of Harry Potter. If that
Okay,
helps.
good. Okay, that's fine. And there are Harry Potter related else. So
no laughing in at me. He's laughing at
no,
me.
no.
No.
No, but that's what I'm. By the way, I'm 49, but really, it never got into that fictional
Sure.
zone. I felt like I'm wasting my time. I needed to be so
right.
That's
evidence.
That's
a common perception. That's why I bring up Einstein. So I'm 48, so we're not big difference in cohort there. So Einstein talks about how creativity is more important than knowledge, because all the knowledge you have others can get, but your own creativity and mind is your own. And J.R. Tolkien did a big lecture. So have you ever heard of Beowulf? Because it was kind of mandated educationally, at least college level, but often at high school. What in the 70s and
like
80s?
The epic poem.
What's that? Beowulf, yeah,
the epic poem Beowulf.
Yes, the epic poem Beowulf. It's an Anglo-Saxon poem from the 500s. I forget what time period, but so Beowulf was unheard of, like other than a few scholars, prior to the 1900s, really. And Tolkien, who was a philologist, which he studies the meaning, evolution, and development of languages. And he was eventually an Oxford dean, a professor at Oxford. I'm being circular here, but anyway, he worked on the Oxford Dictionary for a while. He worked on, I think, all the words under letters Q and W or something like that. I forget which. He has literally helped shape the English language. And he did an essay and a number of presentations called On Monsters and Critics. And I highly recommend reading this. It basically lays out why fantasy and myth should be taken into account. So what you just said about, well, it seems like a waste of time, it's not serious, etc. Well, research is increasingly showing the benefits of these types of activities for the brain and for mental health. If you read Stuart M. Brown's book on play, there's a lot of mental health association issues and cognitive functional issues that happen when people don't engage in a balance of play in their lives. Now, too much play, well, that's an issue too. But there needs to be, it is a requirement for healthy development and functioning in human beings and many other creatures, it turns out. So one of the things that Tolkien did was pointed out that Beowulf should be appreciated not just as a piece of history and anthropology of a time period, from when it was written way back when, but should also be appreciated just for the story that it is. And he was pivotal. He is the reason why anybody has heard of Beowulf. It is because of what he did that Beowulf became taught as a regular, required reading in a lot of schools, college level and sometimes high school level. And
I had to read it in high school.
Yeah, I did too. Yeah, as I say, some people it's high school level, some people it's college level when they get introduced to it. Depends on the schools they go to. I went through private school in the 70s and early 80s, a private Catholic school, and the educational standards there were much higher than the public system. So I was reading stuff in 3rd and 4th grade that my peers didn't read till 12th grade. It was kind of sad. But and that was back when the U.S. Education system was still number one. Now we're like 30 something in the world. It's really declined a lot. Anyway, so circling around. So Tolkien came up with in his fantasy stories, because he also was a lover of the environment and of trees, especially. He created a creature called an Ent. An Ent is basically a living, walking, talking tree. Big, 20-foot tall, living, walking, talking tree. And he called them tree herders, shepherds of the trees, and they were there to protect the trees from those who would try to chop them down and burn them and destroy them from the bad guys. And so in the books and in the movies, there's a major Ent called Treebeard, who a lot of people like a lot. And he speaks very slowly because trees grow slowly. They're around for thousands of years, and they have a slow pace. They're not in a hurry. So I played an Ent. I made up, just a pretend Ent that the kids come across as part of their unraveling the clues. So what happened was they were starting out. There's a festival at a village. It's some summer festival thing. So they're all drumming and doing percussion stuff as our icebreaker activity. All the kids are actually doing this. And then somebody comes running in and is like, help, help. The children from our village have been kidnapped. We need help. We need to find where they went. We think the Wicked Witch of the Woods did it and such. And so then the kids come along with a couple of these different adventurers to break off in 3 different groups and go looking for clues, trying to find where the kids are. And so at one point they come to me, and I am turning bad. I'm going from a good Ent to a bad Ent because the witch has cast a spell on me and making me turn evil. But if they hurry, they can get rid of it by going and finding these ingredients, which we have hidden around the camp, and then mix them in the bucket, and they fill up these water squirters, and if they spray and soak me down, and this is in summer, so I was happy to get soaked. If they saturate me enough, it'll get rid of her evil spell, and then I can help tell them where the kids are, and they can go take on the Wicked Witch. And then the big finale was they find the Wicked Witch and her warrior, and they use water balloons and water squirt wands and stuff to soak them because she's allergic to water, like the Wicked Witch of the West and the Wizard of Oz. And they win and they save the other kids and all of that. And then we go back to have a fun festival and all that. So that was an adventure type LARP as opposed to a combat LARP. And again, some of the kids preferred to do the tabletop version. Some preferred to do it out in the camp. Some kind of alternated. There was less of the alternating there because it was less exhausting since they were mostly just rolling around in their electric wheelchairs compared to the Boffer LARP where they had to lift things up and move them around. So we learned an awful lot by immersing in this program and set the groundwork for doing more work and potential research, etc. And by the way, the director of all those camp programs, she's now on our board, Brooke Lively. She joined RPG Research sometime after. And so you can see our programs have an impact because people start joining us after they see our programs in action, which is great. It's wonderful to have these people on board. So with the prison programs, it's the same thing. We want to first just get our foot in the doors and see if we can get a few community programs running, whether it's just setting up rules so that the prisoners can run their own games with supervision or without, whatever the rules are, or that we run specific programs for them, which is more likely. Just get our foot in the door at a few places, and then over time, aggregate data and figure out what works and doesn't work in preparation for then doing some more formal studies where we have prisoners come in with baseline assessments. We track them over time, see how they do when they're discharged with recidivism, things like that, and then slowly over time aggregate that. So this year, we're just trying to get our foot in the door and learn all we can. We hope by next year we'll have some grant funding that we can do the more formal research. And Plumley in our YouTube channel asks, why would they ban role-playing games in prison? What's the point? Yeah, well, so unfortunately, at least here in the United States, there was a precedent set around 2010, 2011 that prison superintendents can ban any product, service, or person pretty easily. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Basically, all they have to say is they have a reasonable concern about security. They don't have to prove it in any way. There is no burden of proof. They just have to state formally they feel there's a reasonable concern for security, and it can be banned. That was established in 2010, 2011. Prior to that, the banning all happened in the 1980s because of the satanic moral panic of the 1980s, led by Patricia Pulling and the organization Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons. And in conjunction with the NCTRV, which is the National Council on Television Violence, which was led by Dr. Thomas Radecki, who is now in prison, by the way, who is an American psychiatrist. So the two of them led a huge crusade against role-playing games And then he led the crusade against violence in TV and video games. He's one of the reasons why we have the V chip on televisions and why video games have violent ratings and all these other things. So these people have had a real impact. And Patricia Pulling, her son committed suicide, and she blamed it on Dungeons & Dragons and role-playing games, and made it her life mission to get people to stop playing role-playing games. She got a long list of schools around the U.S. and Canada to ban role-playing games at the schools, which at the time were becoming incredibly popular and successful. You can see photos of these big gaming after-school clubs, D&D and role-playing clubs after school, with like 30, 40, 60 kids, in a big photo. And then as soon as she started her efforts, the clubs got smaller and smaller and finally disappeared within just a few years, like 3 to 5 years. It was this incredibly popular thing. Millions of kids in the U.S. were playing it in the early 80s. And she succeeded in really not just shutting down at all these schools and then the prisons. She trained the police, law enforcement departments on how to watch out for the dangers of role-playing games and handling their paraphernalia, which is their gaming books, and how to recognize a role-playing gamer who might be dangerous because they're a role-playing gamer. I kid you not. She had brochures, training programs. They paid her money as a consultant to go around and train police stations on these topics. She was all over the news. She was on 60 Minutes. She was on Canadian Broadcast Company. She was all over. They lobbied Congress to try to pass a law banning role-playing games at any government-funded facility, so libraries, colleges, etc., which is where they were extremely popular. Fortunately, it didn't get through. It fell flat, and it didn't get any real traction, thankfully. But they were able to individually get these places to ban anyway. There just wasn't a federal mandate. So not only did that happen, it created the stigma against gaming. Prior to what they did, there was no negative association with role-playing gaming. But between her and then the media jumping on because of the sensationalism, that's where people started to think that role-playing gaming was a bad thing, that gamers were losers and were more likely to commit murder, commit suicide, were antisocial, etc., etc. And that got inculcated into first the U.S. and then the rest of the world in the mid-1980s. Now, fortunately, as people have been aging out and cohorts have changed, the negative stigma isn't as bad as it used to be. It's growing again in popularity, and but there's still a lot of resistance. And outside of gaming bubbles, in general, most people still have a negative view of role-playing games and gamers, professionals, laypersons, all of them. But the overall acceptance of geekdom and gaming has improved greatly in the last 5 to 10 years. It's amazing how much it's improved. But you still see a less severe version of the negative stereotypes, for example, on Big Bang Theory, where they say that no girls play role-playing games, that boys who play role-playing games will never get dates with girls, that they all play in their mother's basement, they have no jobs, etc., etc. The Big Bang Theory and many others still further perpetuate these myths. And the research shows those are myths. These stereotypes, the research negates that as a reality. It's a myth about gamers. It's not the reality at all. So, and that's been what a lot of the research has been focused on, unfortunately, is just trying to shoot down the negatives. However, in doing so, some interesting, promising data started to come out that, hey, there might be something more than just getting rid of the negatives here. There might be some advantages to this activity. You started to see that the suicide rate of role-playing gamers was a fraction of that of non-role-playing gamers. You started seeing, higher levels of success in different academic areas and linguistic areas, social skills, etc. But the problem is these are correlative and meta-analysis studies, so they don't prove causality. They say, well, we've proven that role-playing gamers aren't the losers that everybody was saying they were. They're less likely to commit suicide, not more likely. They're less likely to commit crimes and less likely to be violent than regular people. Gamers are far less likely to do that than non-gamers. They have lower levels of meaninglessness than their college peers. 40-something% of college peers score high on meaninglessness, only but 17% of gamers. And then psychoticism was also lower score for gamers, whereas non-gamers it was much higher. and psychoticism is a predictor of criminal and other types of behavioral issues. So all of that's really promising, but it is entirely possible that it's these types of people were drawn to gaming and already had the skills necessary, that's why they have these better scores, right? It doesn't prove that the game made them that way. And ultimately, from what I've been seeing, it's a mixture. It's the nature-nurture combination. Some people are drawn to role-playing gaming because they already have the skills, and it gives them an environment where they can exercise their exceptional skills in social, cooperative problem-solving, communication, etc. And then other people who come in who really do not do well socially, autism spectrum and others, at-risk youth we work with all the time, people who come in and they really do struggle socially and cognitively and emotionally and other ways. And the rules of the game and the community of gaming helps them get better. It helps them improve. And there's increasing data to show that now, finally, after all these years, bit by bit. No big, huge studies, no big longitudinal studies, so there's a lot of room to really build and figure out exactly what works and doesn't work. But it's getting better and better. One of the better empirical studies out there is from Kohei Kato. This is specific to autism spectrum. So that's Kohei, and then Kato, Kato. So he's a Japanese PhD student, and I think he has it now and everything. He did a controlled study on autism spectrum youth using role-playing games versus a control group, and doing a baseline assessment and then exit assessments on what he called overall quality of life. And then he drew upon existing tools to measure 8 or so different aspects related to quality of life and functioning and social and empathy and belonging and all these other things, and showed good, strong, measurable difference between the baseline and the exit data. Now, some of it was weaker than others. Some areas were only 0.2, 0.4 area, but some other areas were like 0.6 to 0.8. So that's where you get some nice, some stronger numbers. I think it averaged out to like 0.5 something, which isn't, gold standard, but it's promising. It means, well, okay, there's something going on here. It's better than random. And so that's a good starting place for a lot of people to build on. And then he won some award last year from the country of Japan, like the government, some like 4th place award or something because of his research, which was a big deal. But we do have, so most of his stuff is in Japanese, but we have a couple of posters that he gave to us for our training and share with others that summarize the data and the approach and such. So on our www.rpgresearch.com website, I can't remember if it's on the old one or the new one, if you just type in Kohei Kato or something like that, you should find those posters and you can look at that data. And that's from, I think, 2016 or 17. I hope someday to see a ton of these types of data and studies. And it wasn't a huge group, but it was, it was a fair sample size. It was a good starting point. This is the kind of data we want to see a lot more of, and hopefully that we will be creating in the near future, pending funding and training everybody. Oh, hi there, Kristen. There's a really, really cool book by Laycock about how the religious organizations contribute to this whole ban, as well as I think it's called Dangerous Games. Yes, I'm familiar with that. I'm pretty sure I have it floating around here. Yeah, and I experienced the brunt of it. I was living between California and Utah at the time when it happened, and oh my goodness, it was bad. We used to run our games at the local county and city libraries, and they one by one, there was no government mandate, but all the administrators one by one banned role-playing gaming at the libraries, and then schools were increasingly banning it, and yeah, the backlash was huge. It's yeah, I mean, especially like the 700 Club, and again, you're going to see videos and everything as you go through the self-training of leaders, religious leaders and such, adding to this whole thing. But it was really because of Patricia Pulling and Dr. Thomas Radecki helping her. But Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons was the core of why there's so much negativity. The religious aspect came in later, because what happened was initially they made claims about it causes more suicide. Well, then the research disproved that. Well, it causes you to go kill people. No, the research disproves that. Well, it makes you antisocial and you won't communicate with people and makes you stay in your basement, makes you a loser. And the research disproved that. So then they went, well, it will lead you into the occult. Nope, that was disproven over time as well. Okay, well, it will lead you away from the true word of God and what the Bible says, etc. Little hard, and even that has been disproven, but now you're getting into a theological argument about what is appropriate to do as a Christian or other belief system, what is appropriate behavior or not. And so the extreme representatives of that would say, you know, do not read or have anything in your home that has anything to do with magic and fantasy and the occult or anything like that. Even if it's a made-up story, don't have it. You know, Harry Potter, book burnings, all that stuff. We have a pastor here in town who led a Harry Potter book burning thing about 10, 15 years ago. About 10, 12 years ago. This same pastor, my youngest son's, this tells you how it's still very actively happening. My youngest son's best friend, they met through school in elementary school, so like second, third grade, used to come over here all the time. And then one of the parents found out that we had role-playing games in the house. Now, he was never there when we were running a game, but just because we had role-playing game books in the house, their pastor told him to stay away from our house or demons would take over their child. And that kid was never allowed in our house ever since. And so my son was allowed to go to their house and played over there all the time, but it became a one-sided relationship, which strained the relationship, especially when they moved to schools and such. And slowly over time, you know, the relationship waned for various reasons, but that was a big part of it. So this tells you how bad it is. Just as you'll see a blog posting as recently as March, we were up at Deer Park running our drop-in and RPG programs. And several families literally dragged their kids away from us, telling them, no, you can't participate in these types of games. They're dangerous. And one family, one mother, as she dragged her kid away, said, no, we don't play those kinds of games. The people who play those games kill people. And looking at me loudly, saying this in the parking lot, she's dragging her kid away, right? Not allowing for a conversation, but making it very clear why they were doing what they were doing. This was just up at Deer Park Library just a couple of months ago. So this is still very much an issue. Another example, the director of a division of the Eastern Washington State Hospital came to a professional symposium. They were up there speaking. I was up there speaking, etc. And he came over and was talking to me and asking more about what we do, etc. And in mid-sentence, cut me off as I was explaining the research. I said, well, I don't care what the research says. Role-playing games will be in my facility over my dead body. And he turned on his heel and left. Now, fortunately, his underlings said, well, he's getting near retirement, so once he retires, let's talk about getting these programs over there at Eastern State Hospital. He hasn't quite retired yet, but we're counting the months. So this is everywhere. A study from just a couple of years ago of social workers, I think it was thousands of social workers, I forget the numbers, showed that more than, I think it's 70 or 80% associated role-playing games and gaming with mental health issues. That if you do a role-playing game, you're going to have mental health issues. These are the gatekeepers for care, for services provisioning, all of that. It's a really negative attitude from most social workers about role-playing games. So this is a current issue. And I've got a little bit of grief about bringing this up at our presentations. They're like, why do you keep bringing this up? It's old news. It's blah, blah. Like, no, this is relevant if you're outside of the geekdom fandom bubble. This is everywhere. And we have to take it on head on and shoot it down. And when we do that, if we disprove all of it with the research up front, then we can move forward in the conversation at these conferences with the professionals. And it works great. Every time I've made the mistake of short-circuiting that, like just not worrying about it and going straight to the meat of why we're really there, showing all the programs, they don't hear any of it because as soon as we get to the Q&A section or throughout, they're like, well, what about this? Well, what about this? I heard this. Well, what about this? And so they don't take in any new data. They haven't emptied their cup. It's full of everything they've heard before. So we always have to start our presentations to new groups with a bullet list shooting down the dozen or so inculcated myths. then we can move forward in the conversation. But it can often take half or 3/4 of our time, depending on how much time we have, just to go through and shoot that down sufficiently so we can move forward. So, questions and comments?
It's a lot of information.
Oh, yeah. We'll get ready for lots of fire hoses. But it'll be iterative. You'll hear it again and again, and it'll sink in bit by bit through iteration.
I never knew about that TV chip with polling, you said?
So I don't know his direct, but he's a direct influence. Yeah, but it's the V chip, the violence chip that's in televisions now, where you can set it won't show shows above a certain rating. He was a big, so he founded the the National Council on Television Violence. It's Dr. Thomas Radecki. He's a U.S. You can look him up. He's a U.S. psychiatrist, PhD, who had his license revoked multiple times in later years, the 90s and 2000s, because it turned out he was trading drug prescriptions for sex.
Oh.
He's now in prison, finally. Just a few years ago, he finally took it too far, and now he's in prison, decades later. Because they revoke his license, he'd do whatever he had to do, he'd get his license back, he'd go back into practice, and then he'd get it revoked again, and then finally he went to prison. But he was one of the forefronts against television violence. And so he had a big influence on a lot of the concepts now about media and video games and television and all of that. He had a big influence on that. And Patricia Pulling, single-handedly, by putting together a bot about Dungeons & Dragons, had this huge ripple effect against role-playing games. And he used his connections to help her grow that as well. So there are interviews of the two of them on these topics from the 80s. So, yeah, and you will, as you go through the training, you will see these video clips. I will not just talk about them, you will see the actual interviews as you go through your training. You've logged into the site and seen the training checklist?
I think I glanced at it when you sent it to me once.
Yeah, so you'll want to start going through that once all your paperwork's in.
Yeah, because I told you, still haven't, I would have to go to someone's home. I'm not set up yet. I'm still getting going, the movement,
sure. No hurry.
Transition.
Yeah, no biggie, but I'm just letting you know that's all the stuff you're going to learn in detail over time. I whenever I make claims, I do everything I can to show you, not just tell you, but show you yes, this is a real thing. Because some people just don't believe it. Like this person, Plumley, saying, what's the point with banning role-playing games in prison? So what the prisons say is it's a security risk. They claim that it'll lead to violence in the prison, or that they will use it to plan an escape or plan a riot. So their argument is because the game involves a lot of cooperative play and planning, that they're going to use that to commit crimes in the prison. And that'll help them be better escapees to plan an escape and everything. Now, that is certainly theoretically possible. There is not one single case that, prior to the bans, that supports that. Nobody, and they didn't have to. The Supreme Court ruled they don't have to prove a security risk. They just have to have a reasonable concern, and it's in legal quotes, reasonable. What does that mean? Of a security concern to ban anything. And so that has stuck since about 2010, 2011. So we have, all the data on that aggregating in our research section there. So this is still a current, recent topic, right? The effects of what happened in the 80s is still going on today. It's crazy. So it's a lot of work trying, because so for example, there's a place here in town called maybe I better not use their name. There is a place here that used to be an orphanage, and it is kind of a quasi one. It's a safe home for homeless kids, all the way up until they're 18. And they live on campus in these buildings over out in the Spokane Valley area. Wonderful. They have all these acreage. It was all donated by some very wealthy folks who created a foundation in the early 1900s to help these kids out. And a lot of businesses donate services to help these kids. So you've got people coming over there with horseback rides and other great activities and, having a great time. So when I was there at a compassion-focused therapy workshop, the staff was really excited to hear about the stuff that we do. And so they wanted us to bring our programs over. So we started the back and forth conversation, and we were scheduling coming over and doing a presentation. Well, then they took it to the board, and the board consisted of some older folks, more senior adults. And they immediately, once they heard that it was role-playing gaming, they immediately shot it down and canceled and says, no, we do not allow the kids to participate in those kinds of activities. Mm-hmm. And the staff was excited about it, but the board shut it down. So this is and that was just a couple of years ago. So this is a very present issue. They never even gave us the chance to present on the topic. Now, where, most of the time it works out. If we get to present, 95% of the time it goes well, that people want us there after we get to present. For example, Spokane Public School District, they had tried to run a role-playing game program. This is at an alternative school here in Spokane. It's the alternative school for the alternative school. So if a kid's struggling, not doing well, scores, low on IQ or functioning, etc., they get certain resources. And then if they get in trouble and really struggle, they get put in the alternative school for that district. So like Meade School District, Meade Alternative School, etc. But then if they are too disruptive or have too many problems in that alternative school, they get sent to Eagle Peak Alternative School, which is the alternative school for all the alternative schools in the area. And it's about 100 kids from 4th through 12th grade. So these are kids who are really struggling. This is their last chance to make it through school, right? Mm-hmm. After this, they're at best going to have a GED, but most likely won't even have that. And a lot of them are in gang trouble and, in and out of juvie and just really struggling. These poor kids, often coming from families with a lot of violence and drugs. They have no stability in their life. The only food they often get is from the lunches and breakfasts they get by coming to school. So these kids are really struggling. These are the at-risk of the at-risk youth. And it's the last chance to try to really help them finish high school and maybe turn things around before they probably end up in the adult prison system. And many of them do, unfortunately, end up there. So they had tried to introduce, because a couple of teachers were into role-playing gaming, and so they set up a Dungeons & Dragons game and tried to run it. Now, these are teachers at this school who have all the training to deal with these kids. And they had a fair number of years of role-playing gaming. But they didn't, this is what we run into all the time, they didn't have the crossover between the two. They had knowledge domain over here on one end and knowledge domain on the other end, but they didn't have how to fit those two pieces together effectively. And unfortunately, after a few sessions, they had to cancel it because it disintegrated. The program, somebody flipped a table, people went at each other. It didn't go well. And there was some promise there, but they didn't know how to make it work. Now, luckily, this is something I've been doing in schools since 1985 and working with all these populations since then. And then in the therapeutic perspective since 2004. And then we've been training the last few years, all the staff. So eventually they heard about us and they asked us to come do a presentation. But the principal explicitly said, we have a lot of parents who are concerned about the dangers of role-playing games and Dungeons & Dragons because of everything they've heard in the press and from their pastors and such. So we need you to do most of your presentation on, or explain to me, the principal, why this should be considered with our population, considering the dangers with at-risk the population. Which is great that they asked for this up front, right? I already knew from experience now that this is always what I have to do, but they explicitly asked for it. So we spent most of our presentation, and there were a lot of teachers there, the principal, and then a few parents. And we were able to one by one address all their concerns. And then we were able to lay out and look at all these benefits that so far the research is pointing to. And then from our own programs, the data we've seen, which we can't publish through IRB, but we have seen it from my private practice with the LSE and then with our RPG research stuff, how well it works. And we are explicitly trained to run these programs with these populations. We know tricks that work, tricks of the trade, on how to deliver a role-playing game and work with this population so it doesn't get out of hand. There's no guarantees, but statistically, we've had a really good success rate. So they were really excited, and they basically want us to start providing a weekly program immediately. Well, that's beyond the scope of RPG research, right? Now we're going from research and community information and volunteerism to they wanted a regular, reliable, professional service every week. And at that point, that's why we referred them to RPG Therapeutics LLC, because that's the type of service they were requesting. And so on the LLC side, we've been delivering service there since for some months, and the program has gone very well for the kids that have attended. They really struggle with attendance at that school. For example, the other day we got there and they had just been on a lockdown. And so a lot of kids had gone home early because there'd been 2 different outbreaks of kids trying to kick in the lunchroom security doors. And one of them, the lunchroom security door, came off the hinges. They kicked it so hard. So the kids in the lunchroom were terrified because it was 2 different. One kid was kicking in one door and one kid on the other side of the lunchroom was kicking the other door. And the kids are huddling here, right? They're on lockdown. They don't know why. So the kids are all scared. They're all activated. And one of the doors tore off the hinges, which so it just reinforced a lot of the scariness for the kids. So again, I wasn't there. This is secondhand information, but that's my understanding of what happened. So a lot of the kids just went home early because they were too shaken up and exhausted from the emotion and such. And so that's a common struggle with this population. So our attendance numbers fluctuate wildly depending upon how their day went before they get to us, right? Because we're an after-school program. But it's a paid program. And the way that works is it's not tax dollars. Other businesses have donated to the school money so that they could pay for these services to help these kids get these benefits. And we have not had a single incident now in several months of running this program in our program. The kids, in fact, some of the kids, if they feel like they're going to lose it just because they're having an emotionally rough day, they literally leave and go to another room to go, scream or yell or whatever. They don't lose it at the table.
Huh.
The ratings they have given on a scale of 1 to 10 for enjoyment have typically between 7 to 9, with a number of them listing 10 as far as the best experience they've ever had in their lives. And this last week they rated it 50. So, these kids are, this is all new for them. So their ability to rate these things and their self-regulation obviously problematic, but it tells you their level of enthusiasm. They literally are rating these experiences just a couple hours once a week as the single best experiences of their life, which is both sad and wonderful, right? It's sad that this is their best experience out of all the other experiences they could have had. It's wonderful that they got to have that experience. So, but you can see again how these topics all interweave. And if we didn't have the research, we wouldn't be able to do the programs, because the research is necessary for getting the foot in the door. And the programs help inform the research, right? Because it always generates new questions and new challenges and new perspectives that we didn't see. And so that's why it's generally about a 5-to-2 ratio. 5 days of the week we're research, 2 days of the week we're community. And that's kind of how it works out. Questions and comments on this so far?
Well, it seems to me it would be so much easier to go through the system because you have to convince one person, more or less. And it's more of a private industry. So if you bring the funds from other people, like the video gaming, right? You need the support because that's where the money is pouring. But for me, one thing that goes through my mind would be to begin with a foster group at a very young age, to find a group home or a foster group where the kids are very young, and to continue following them, whether they go through the system again or not, and continue with the consistency with this RPG in their lives, and to see they have a cohort going, and and I would start that very, very, because this is the whole idea where I would find very fascinating. That's why I like neuroscience, is to also get a scan of their brain in regards to, to see what's going on up there, because many times we treat the symptoms, and the symptoms many times are now what the brain. It mimics some of the symptoms of other conditions. And so that's what I noticed with the research. You say, oh, he's got ADHD, but he's not. Actually, he's got a tumor growing in his brain. And and you pop pills and the kid gets more violent and you don't know why. And the system doesn't work and you lock him up, and there's so many things. So I don't know if you ever thought about reaching out to a very young group, a foster group or group home, and then continue with them. That would be a beautiful,
Yes, well, that was, so for example, that board that I told you that nixed the program, that was that type of facility where the kids come in very young and are there till they're 18. And the staff was very excited to have us come in, and again, the board nixed it. Now, as far as research studies, because what you're describing is a longitudinal study, which is what we want, right? That's the gold standard, a controlled, double, triple blind, longitudinal study where you can do a lifelong progress and then add, neuroscans, EEGs, etc. That is the dream I have someday of, in stages happening if we ever get the funding. I have worked with children as young as 2 years old, nonverbal autism spectrum with these programs. A program through Eastern Washington University that's now defunct, but it ran about 12 years till, funding. The point was to mainstream autism spectrum toddlers, so they were 2.5 to 5 years old. They'd be paired up with their non-neuroatypical peers and go through this couple of years program in preschool, basically. And the goal was to get them to be mainstreamed into the regular public school system, through all the regular classes. So the goal was mainstreaming. And they ran it for about 12 years, and it was very successful. These kids were able to get through the program. So we were brought in, and this is when I was trained as a recreational therapist and such, and we were supposed to come up with activities that tried to keep these kids working cooperatively together on an activity for, between 15 to 20 minutes, that they stayed, that they did the activity, that they completed the activity, that they met certain criteria, that they stayed engaged. And everybody came up with their different recreation therapy activities that they were going to do with these groups. And I, working with my team, proposed doing adaptive LARP, live action role-playing game, with the kids. And I talked my team into that. I had 2 others I was partnered with. And they were like, okay, yeah, let's try that. They knew nothing about role-playing gaming, but they'd heard me talking about it in class. So we put together a program. And ours was the only one that all of the groups... we had one participant who didn't quite make it to the very end, but every single one of our participants participated for the entire duration. All of the others generally started to lose interest after about 5 or 10 minutes. And this is a typical thing I've seen time and time and time again with our programs. We had one exception out of the kids. This was the one who was most profoundly had the most profound impairment. Nonverbal, highly stereotyped behaviors, the hand flapping, etc. Greatly struggling. And this one made it all the way, like 90% of the way through the story adventure and everything, and then stopped at stacking the dice. We had these big foam dice, and this person stopped at stacking and restacking. And if I knocked it over, the person put them back in the same exact order. So fixated, stereotype behaviors. However, was happy as a clam. Almost never smiled, was smiling, had made it through the program working cooperatively with their peer, which generally never happened. So their supervisors and teachers said that was the most astounding success they'd ever seen. They'd never seen this person do this well. And so for us, we were like, oh, crap, didn't quite get all the way to the last step. And they're like, no, you don't understand. This is huge. And then all the others went all the way through and were very successful. And so that, and that's been something we've had repeatable success with different populations. It's a funding thing at this point, right? Right now we're training and building our staff so that when we do get funding, we're ready to do exactly these kinds of studies, causal controlled, really get some good hard data. Regarding the neuroscience monitoring, so I don't know if you know, I have EEG equipment here, electroencephalogram equipment. Which we can't use without, IRB on other people, but I've used on myself just to experiment and learn, right? I can do that. I can experiment on myself all I want. I'm not allowed to put it on other people. However, other individuals are allowed to do it to themselves if they want to, right? We have to be very careful about that. But it's open source. It's called Open EEG between the hardware and the software. And, it's mostly passive, and you hook up the electrodes and you can monitor the different brain states, and you install like Brain Bay or some other software. There's several choices. And my hope is someday because there's this concept of immersion and flow state from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. It's a Hungarian psychologist. Again, you will learn lots about this over time. And flow state is supposed to be this ultimate state of immersion where you have loss of time. It's complete focus. There's a whole 10-minute video you will see that I put together showing examples between sports and role-playing gaming. In sports, they call it being in the zone. And then Mihai Csikszentmihalyi calls it flow state. And so I do this 10-minute intro video to the concepts of flow state, and then we go much deeper in later training. So some of the examples are, you play the game for 2 hours, you look up, it feels like only half an hour transpired, you look up and you see that it's night, right? The sunset, and you didn't even realize it. You're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that much time went by. I was so engrossed in the activity. And what the theory suggests is that when you're at a high level of immersion at the point of flow state, it is a maximal state for learning and efficacy. Mm-hmm. So whether it's mental health learning, whether it's physical skills learning, whether it's well-being, because it does draw on a lot of positive psychology concepts, that when you can achieve immersion to the level of flow state, you are at your maximum level of learning, focus, and ability to grow and benefit, etc. So most of our programs are informed by trying to maximize opportunities for the highest levels of immersion and the potential for flow state experiences. And in looking at different assessment tools and also trying to work on our own, we have what we call an observational immersion scale, which is still being worked on. There's a long way to go for it to be what I want it to be. But basically through observed body language, and again, it has confounds with certain populations that don't show, that aren't labile and things like that, but you can pick up other cues. We're able to observationally tell and predict what somebody's going to score their experience as. So if we're observing them and on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 is completely distracted. They're not paying any attention to the game master. Every stimulus that happens, they're looking over here and there. They're not listening to the conversation. They're just not engaged at all. And really, that's more of a 0 than anything. And a 1 is they're like kind of listening to the GM, but they're really not engaged. You go up the scale, and then around 4, you've got a lot of people hit about a 4 of immersion where they're engaged in the activity, they're paying attention, but they're easily distracted by stimulus. So if I slam a door, drop a book, or even just come walking in, they're going to look up and glance, and they're just aware of the stimulus of me coming in the room, walking around, looking at them, etc. When they start to get to a 5, some of the lighter stimulus, they're going to stop noticing. They're not going to notice as much me just coming to the door if I do so quietly, etc. And so it goes up the scale. And what I generally observe is most role-playing gamers in an average game that goes well, not a crappy game, but an average going well game, get to about this 4 to 6 level of immersion. Then we start to get into the exceptional immersion, where we start to hit the 6 to 7 range, like round 7, where I can drop a book on the floor and nobody jumps or looks up at it. They're not even aware of the stimulus. They've tuned it out completely. They're so immersed and engrossed in the activity. And so for folks like that, and we see it all the time, they're generally, when they do their self-assessment of their enjoyment levels of the activity, it's going to be a very high score. When they're at 4 to 6, it's generally going to be good scores, but they won't quite necessarily show that they don't have a loss of time, etc. When they start to get what we rate as an observed scale of 7, that's where we start seeing people reporting, oh yeah, I lost track of time, or oh, I was just so into it, I could visualize it, etc., etc. Now, 10 is kind of this utopian ideal of flow state immersion. I've never scored anybody at a 10, but it's having it on the range, and that would just be completely engrossed in the level of activity. And again, this is something we're still working on and adjusting to see how accurate and predictable and valid and reliable it will be over time. But this concept of immersion and potential for flow state highly informs our delivery of services and how we do the research, because according to the theory, if we can give them as many opportunities for flow state, whatever the benefits are of the activity, that will maximize those benefits, right? If they're not immersed, whatever the benefits are of the activity, they're really not going to get very much of. They may get some. So it's like, bicycling. If they sit on the bicycle and barely bicycle, they barely push, they don't get their heart rate up, they just kind of laze along and doing whatever, they'll get some inherent benefit, from the physical exercise of the bike, but it's going to be minimal. Now, there's the other extreme, of course, where you can overdo it with the exercise analogy, so we don't go too far with that. But if they're more engaged and they're more focused and they're in it and they're writing, they get their heart rate up, they're more likely to see a lot more benefit from the inherent benefits of bicycle riding, right? So same with the role-playing gaming. If we can get them to where they're really engaged in it, theoretically, that's where we'll see the best benefit. So a lot of time has been spent trying to learn how to optimize the role-playing game experience. So there's a whole section, which will probably be a book at some point, on RPG optimization on our websites, which breaks down all these different bits and pieces. And it's more of a template with a lot of gaps to be filled, but it has a lot of useful information. And that informs... So if role-playing gaming has benefits, which research seems to indicate it does, then the question is, how do you get the most of the benefits in the shortest time possible? Part of the RPG optimization is, what's the group size that works versus doesn't work? When you get too many people, people have a less enjoyable experience for the tabletop. LARP is a different story. Electronic is a different story. We're talking tabletop at this moment. What environmental variables affect? So I'm trying to figure out all of the confounds in this multivariate experience that is role-playing gaming and dial them in and make it a predictable thing. And so from 2010 to 2012, I did these studies with over 120 participants for about a 1 to 2 year period, just fiddling with things like room temperature, lighting, table layout, number of participants, frequency of the sessions, duration of the sessions, just things like that, right? And these were not therapeutic interventions. These were just measuring enjoyment. So this was just optimizing the recreational experience for the sake of recreation. So they would score at the end, how much fun did you have on a scale of 1 to 10? They'd have a few simple questions. And I would, in the aggregate, over time, see trending. So if I brought the room temperature up to 74 degrees, generally the scores in all the groups went down, notably. You know, if I cranked it up to 80, they went way down. You get into that 68 to 72 range, you know, everybody's got their different homeostats. You know, some people like it warmer, some people like it colder. But when I got above 74, it started to really be noticeable. Another example was related to screens at the table. Now, Ian, did we cover any of that last time about the screens at the table?
Yeah, you were telling me how, like, some of the results of some research you guys have done was like, if there's just, you don't even have to be on, if just the phones on the table, people are like 80% less immersed or something like that. It was like a crazy degree, it seemed like.
Well, so to put in the context of the optimization, so you got a scale of 1 to 10. 1 is, you know, horrible experience, didn't enjoy it at all. 10 is best experience in their life. An average experience is going to be a 5, right? And we're happy to get a 5. We don't have any problem with 5s. That's great. People had a good time. They enjoyed it. But we want to get better than that. And so through this RPG optimization, generally, my experience when I GM, and this is where there's a person, this is one of the confounds. The individual affects the results of the game. And this is a big problem for doing this kind of research. A good GM makes for a much better role-playing game experience than a crappy GM. It's just a fact. Anytime you have a facilitator, that becomes another confound you have to take into account. Well, the only way to address that is you've got to have that particular facilitator run a lot of samples and other facilitators run a lot of samples so that over time you get aggregate data and you can figure out trending. You can't accurately say. So people started paying me as a professional game master in 1983. I was 13 years old and college students on up were paying me to run their role-playing games. I ran 2 on Saturday, 2 groups on Saturday, 1 on Sunday. And, you know, there was just a New York City television station just put a video out yesterday of a guy who's making 100 an hour as a paid game master there. And I'm like, yeah, so? Because I've made 100, 200 an hour easily for years on and off as a game master. But that's me, right? That's the confound is that doesn't prove anything about role-playing gaming itself. I bring into my acting skills and voicing skills and whatever people either like or hate me or whatever, but I have a huge influence on your experience of the game. That doesn't prove anything about the game by itself. So years ago, when I was doing this before we had the other staff, the question was, well, how much is this just Hawk being a better than average game master, and how much is the game itself? So I have all this therapeutic background, so I'm able to facilitate people with different therapeutic issues in a game, and even though they're not there for therapy, they may have functional benefits. Was that the game, or was that Hawk's training that did that? Right? This is a problem. These are the confounds we have to take into account. And then the other question was, can I make this repeatable? So here's all these things I've learned to run a better game. Can I train other people who don't have the inherent ability? Can I make them a better game master by teaching them these techniques and the optimization and all of that? Is it repeatable in other people? Now, some people will have more natural talent than others, right? Some will pick it up better than others. But in the aggregate, as I train and teach people, will their game mastering get better, and then will the scores from their players get better because they became better game masters? Even if they never, and I'm not trying to do braggadocio, I'm just using it as an example. So even if they never get to Hawk's level of GMing, if you will, I cringe using that, but I'm just trying to give that example. Even if they never get to that level, do they go from their baseline here, scoring averages of 2s and 3s, to, let's say, 7s, right? Which is above average, right? If we got 5 and we get them up to 7s from 2s and 3s, or even from 5 to 7s. Can I do that? Can I bring in just different people from all walks of life and age and background and show consistently improvement? And I could not tell you that 15 years ago. I can now clearly tell you that. I can tell you that unequivocally, that these techniques will raise up several points somebody's game mastering skills. And generally, the worse they are, as long as they're open to learning, there is a threshold of mental health issues and such that can prevent it. But within a certain threshold, even though scoring as low as a 2 or 3 can get great improvement. Whether or not they'll ever get to an 8, 9, or 10 is less important to me than that there's measurable, consistent growth at all different levels. And this is young kids GMing. This is older folks in their 60s GMing, 60s and 70s, learning it for the first time, and everything in between. It shows up. Young and old, people who have never role played before, coming in and just learning for a year or two, versus people who are old grognards who've been GMing for 30 years and 40 years like I have, and making them a better GM. Even though they've got their way of doing things, they grew another point or two, right? They're already pretty established, a veteran gamer, and still was able to show an improvement. So that takes into account those potential confounds between individuals. But it's getting aggregation of this data. So with the optimization thing, I was the only GM for all of these groups. As I said, over 120 people over a 1 to 2 year period. And to add to the confounds, each group played a different role-playing game in different setting. And nobody was allowed, for the most part, nobody was allowed to be in more than one group. So often people would sign up. I got them through Meetup and Facebook and billboard postings, what have you, not bulletin board postings. And if someone wanted to play 2 or 3 groups, because like, oh, I love that game. They're like, nope, sorry, pick one. That's the only one you can be in during this time period. And they had to fill out a ton of paperwork when they came in. They all did baseline assessments, etc. And then they regularly, after each session, were filling out their enjoyment levels. And everything was recorded. We got audio and video of all of it, etc. For the most part. There were a couple of glitches here and there, unfortunately. But, and then, so, talking about the screens. If the average score was 7, let's use a number that has some wiggle room here. Let's say the average score was 7 for enjoyment, which is pretty high. This is a Likert scale, so that's pretty good. 5 is a good average experience. Anything above that is gravy. And so turning up the room temperature to 80 degrees, that would drop a point or 2 easily. People get irritable, they're uncomfortable, they're having trouble staying awake, they're not enjoying the game. Those points would easily drop. But even with that, we're only talking a point or 2 or 3, even with the temperature being miserable. Which I've seen in the wild, because when we run like Tolkien and such, we got 30, 40 people in my house, and initially I didn't have enough air conditioning capacity for all those people. And so people were sweating for 3 days coming to play Tolkien Mood each year, and that was the number one complaint was the temperature. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm working on buying more air conditioners, etc. But they still scored the moot that they had a great time, and they kept coming back each year. Some of them from other parts of the world. And I was like, this is miserable temperature. I wouldn't come back for this, right? And then eventually got the air conditioning better, and that made it all better, and the scores got better. But that still only typically dropped 1 to 3 points. And so playing with the lighting, layout, etc., similar results. Well, so that's a pretty extreme example, right? Cranking it up to 80 degrees, 1 to 2 at most, 3 points loss of game. So we dropped to about a 5 or a 4. And again, I'm really grossly averaging here, but it gives you the general concept. So having an electronic screen, it's not the device itself, but having a screen like a smartphone, a tablet, a laptop, a projector, a flat screen in the table to use as a map to help enhance the mapping features. All of these lowered the enjoyment scores between 1 to 3 points every single time. Now, some game sessions are better than others, so again, we're talking in the aggregate here. And the more screens there were, the lower the scores. And also, what was really interesting to notice was if one person had a device, so I intentionally let people do it, or I asked them to go ahead and do it, but usually I just let them do it if they're doing it. If one person had a device, their score was, for example, 2 points lower, but everybody else at the table was 1 point lower. So they're having the device that they're looking at, nobody else is using it, but that they're using it, even if it's down here under the table and they're doing it and they keep bringing it up and down and up and down, having it on the table and it buzzes from time to time and they flip it and look at it, put it down. If it's just sitting there and it's not doing anything, that's not a problem as long as there's no, as long as it's face down, whatever, that's not a problem. But the screen being used, etc., affected everybody at the table. It basically was ruining the game for everybody else to some degree, right on a scale of ruining, if you will. And things that I thought would add immersion, because I thought it was very cool, because there's a therapist in town who loves to use a flat screen TV as the battle mat, and then he uses Excel to show. I have campaign cartographer and stuff, so I have more advanced tools, but he does some pretty cool stuff with his flat screen for the battle mat. And I had played around with that with a projector and a flat screen before I met him. I didn't do it the way he did, like he took it to conventions and everything, but I did experiment with that way back when. And so I was doing that in the studies, and that still dropped a little bit the immersion. Now, what it did improve is, have you guys yet read about aphantasia? I talk about aphantasia in some of my training later. Either of you know what aphantasia is?
Not yet.
Okay. So aphantasia is, hey, John, welcome, is the inability of somebody to basically, in their mind's eye, imagine a scene visually. So if I describe a room, you come in, it's 10 feet wide by 20 feet long with 10-foot high ceilings. The walls are all made of stone. You can hear a dripping sound in the distance. There's an iron-bound wooden door on the opposite end. You just came in from a passage behind you in this deep, dark dungeon. There's a flickering torch in the far upper left-hand corner of the wall that you're facing with the door. As I tell you these, it should be evoking some sort of imagery in your head, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I like to use other senses like sound and smell and touch and all those things too, but we're kind of focusing on the visual aspect here. For people with aphantasia, and this is a debated disorder, right? This is something that's kind of come and gone, and there hasn't been much research done on it yet. But I've been doing a little bit of research. We run into people who cannot visualize when we do theater of the mind. If we don't put miniatures on the table or a whiteboard or some way to help them track who is relative to where, these are the people who get really frustrated with this game because they can't keep track, especially in tactical situations, as to what is where, because they can't visualize it in their mind. And Professor Colts, who's at East Washington University, who runs the compassion-focused therapy programs, is one of these people. He can totally imagine taste, touch, sound, all those other senses. But he says adamantly, he cannot visualize in his mind a scene. Now, if he's seen a photo or seen a place, he can remember it. He can then evoke that image in his mind and remember it. but he can't create it from an imaginary description. Now, how many people are impacted by this? Again, it's still a debated topic. There's not enough research, is unknown. But we try to take that into account. So those with aphantasia, the people that I think showed signs of that, props like the flat screen on the table as a battle mat and such did help. But so did just drawing on a battle mat and using miniatures. But they at least would score the same or slightly better, whereas everybody else scored lower because there was a screen at the table. So for disabilities, for accessibility, inclusiveness, and adaptive needs, screens and technology are very helpful. Dice rollers, for visually impaired, things like that. Certainly for those kinds of considerations, having a screen is very, very helpful. Let's see. Kristen says, there is research in higher education classrooms that speak to the same thing. Engagement for students with screens is lower, resulting in lower grades, and it affects the people around them as well. It's interesting. I'd love to see more of that. My theory is when we look at a screen, our brains have to operate differently in an interpretive mode than when we're trying to use our imagination. And that is different than looking at a picture or at miniatures or drawing on a battle mat, because a battle mat's a two-dimensional surface. If you don't use miniatures and you're just drawing on it, or a whiteboard is two-dimensional. I don't show lower scores with using a whiteboard or a battle mat or maps or tokens. None of those seem to affect it. It's every time I bring in an electronic screen that's when they seem to get dinged. And so I would love to do some more controlled studies to figure out what is it about it and where can it be used, because I'm an advocate for technology. I've been involved with technology since the 70s. I was CTO, CIO. I believe in the power of technology to help people in so many ways. I could not have had the successes I had without technology. I would have never gotten through school and other things without the help of a keyboard and other things, because I have my own LDs and such to deal with. So,
I wonder,
yes.
Do you think that might have to do with the expectancy that the screen will do everything for you, so you don't have to engage as much also? It's almost when you type a word,
I don't know. I don't think so. It may be. Again, there's not enough data to know. I don't think so. My gut says it is that we're engaging, and again, this is where having functional MRI and PET and stuff would be great, or even EEG, that when you look at an electronic screen, and it won't matter whether you're a little baby or an adult who's very experienced, whatever, that our brains, it's like, how some animals try to watch television, but they can't really follow it. Their brains don't process what's on the screen. They hear the sounds, but they can't interpret what's on the screen in a way that's useful to them. Is my understanding. Are you aware of that? How some animals seem to be able to follow what's on a TV screen and others can't?
I have heard of that.
Yeah. Well, that means there's a neurocognitive difference in our brains versus those animals. Well, then that means there's a different processing going on between the physical world and this screen world. There's some kind of interpretation going on for us to make sense of what's on a screen, even as little babies, that our brains can handle and make sense of, that some more primitive brains can't even make sense of. Well, then that means there's some circuit going on, some set of systems in our brains that functions differently when we're looking at a screen versus a whiteboard or a battle mat.
And what I heard about, for example, I don't know if that relates, but with the baby born with the inability to see, if you were trying to change the lenses, no impact. They will be blind for the rest of his life or less ability to see.
Yeah,
but if you have a 68-year-old woman, let's say, with inability to see in one eye, once you have the surgery done, because of the continuous practice of using of the optical nerve brain connection, practice of vision, although couldn't see, after the surgery is back to seeing. So You're right. Sometimes, it will be very interesting to look into that.
So these are all, again, we have 200 plus research questions we want to answer. These are just one of many. And if we ever get enough funding, we'll be doing research like this left and right. That is the dream that I hope someday we'll get to.
I am a visual processor. I can tell you that. I would love to see and to hear.
Yeah.
But so that, I can see that.
Now, are you a person who ascribes to the concept of learning styles?
You know what? I think that has something to do, and we have done through in school system. You probably heard about AVID strategies where study skills are being reintegrated for the kids who are in an average C, but we want to push them for college level. And so when you go through some assessments, somebody's telling you something and where the eyes go, versus ceiling to the floor and whether you're kinesthetic and stuff, they see some correlation there. And so I think that the personality style, yes, definitely has something to do with it. Because like I said, if you go back to a baby being born, like I gave you the scenario, you can do the surgery, nothing will happen. So it's the practice of it. And, that's why these kids with the screens and computers, they're born into screens and looking. And so I don't think the brain engages as much in a certain style of learning. And I do believe some are more than one. Yes, we have used that. And I find it to be that the more engaging with all styles of learning, the better they are. But you want to focus on their strength, and they better know their strength because that comes to their advantage.
Let me take it to a more basic question.
Yeah.
So the early stages of learning style, you had a more nuanced response, which is great. But the early phases of learning style that really started to pick up during the 70s and 80s and accelerated since, that most people still ascribe to, is that some people are visual learners, some people are auditory learners, some people are kinesthetic doing learners. Is that what you ascribe? Yes. You believe that?
Yeah, that's exactly what I had in mind. Yes.
I was taught that in high school 4 years ago.
I understand. Everybody's been taught this. Guess what the neuroscience says with solid evidence. So the evidence.
And I haven't looked at it.
Yeah. So the evidence
what's the name of the study?
I'll give you. You'll learn all of this. I have tons and tons of references for this information because of my neuroscience background. Okay. What the study says, the research on learning styles for neurotypical. So remember, neuroscience by default studies neurotypical, the average human being. It generally does not focus on disorders. So it generally does not focus on learning disorders. It generally does not focus on mental health issues. It generally does not initially focus on neuroatypical. They're trying to establish.
So probably they had a central tendency, and they looked at the variation. Is that quantitative data?
So the neurotypical, the majority of people, everybody learns the same way. So and the people doing the studies of the proponents of these learning styles, it turns out if you go through and do a literature analysis of the research is pretty bad. There isn't strong support for learning styles for neurotypical people. The moment you go to neuroatypical, any kind of disability, neuro differences, then it completely changes. So for adaptive and for non-neurotypical people, yes, it looks like learning. I mean, it's pretty obvious. Somebody who's blind is not going to learn visually, who's been blind all their life. But, so you have to learn through other techniques, auditory, etc. But for neurotypical, the vast majority, the research strongly, clearly shows that the majority of human beings learn the same way. Not visual versus auditory versus experiential. It's the same for everybody who's neurotypical.
Well, here to give you an example, because this is something that I just was listening to, a conference on neuroplasticity, Stanford, I forgot her name, but they were talking about how come that, for example, I have an accent. I'm Romanian based. I came here to the States. I learned the language. My accent really never goes away. Yeah. But if you have a baby to a certain age, young, I don't know, 5, 6, I don't know what the age is. If you teach them a new language, never will acquire an accent. So that will be able to speak the language, Japanese, English, Romanian, without an accent. And so I'm older, though. I came here, I have an accent.
That's
so there
phonemes.
is yes.
That's all because of phonemes.
Well, but there is something related to the brain development.
Yes, related to
and so you got to enter that stage, because that's why I said if you go to the foster group at an earlier age, you can follow through because you have that genetic piece
Yeah.
that will be great information for
Well, it
others.
is part of the use it or lose it principle. So what they've found with phonemes, which are the smallest units of sound that can make up language, and during your first 8 months of exposure to sounds, that is the core foundation, around 8 to 18 months, depending upon the studies. That is the core foundation, because when you're born with all the neurons as a baseline. I mean, it turns out now we can develop new neurons and all that, but as far as our number of neurons, we have a ton of neurons we're born with, but they're completely inefficient, right? There's no routing. I like to use the example of the United States before the interstate system used to have a circuit of dirt and highways all over the country. And if you try to go from New York to California, before Route 66 and all that, it took you a long time of zigzagging through all these routes to get from New York to California driving. And then you start to get Route 66 and then the interstate system, where now you have these short paths where you go very quickly from point A to point B, and you can hop on and off as you need to. And so with neural pruning, and then neural development, neuroplasticity, all that, as the baby's exposed and starts to consolidate and route these things, they get more efficient. But then the brain is going through the highest period of neural pruning is in that first 3 to 6 years. Then it kind of stabilizes from around the 6 to 12 year period, depending upon onset of puberty. Then the second most intensive period of neural pruning is around puberty. And that doesn't fully stabilize till late teens, early 20s. And then the myelination of some key controls between the frontal cortex and the primal brain and such, that doesn't even finish until your early to mid 20s. So really until about your early to mid 20s, your brain hasn't even stabilized. And you see a lot of behavioral indications of that. So 2 major periods of neural pruning, babyhood and adolescence. Very radical changes in the brain at the neuron level and how it's routing and redirecting, etc. And
I did hear about the network of wires at the baby stage, where what my understanding nowadays is, and they're finding out they're there just in case. So you have all possibilities in your brain, and just in case you're going to be a Japanese kid, you're going to learn Japanese. So I heard about sprouting and pruning, and
that's
I
the
understand
phoneme.
the synapses and the usage practice. I do get that.
Exactly. So as the baby is in the womb and they're hearing certain sounds, and then after they're born, for about 6 to 18 months, depending upon the studies, it's now putting in pretty solidly, and it's pretty solid by 6 years, the phonemes that you can actually hear. So after that, it's really hard for you to even hear the sounds that are outside of your core language. You literally cannot hear the difference. That's why people who don't learn a language till later in life, it's almost impossible for them to get rid of the accent without really rigorous training, because they don't hear the difference. It's just not there in their brain to take in the difference. Is it impossible? No. It just takes way more training than most people can afford to do. So these are all things we're going to increasingly go deeper and deeper and deeper into all these topics as you go through your training.
Yeah, I like this. I like this
Awesome
stuff. I love it.
Awesome. Ian, do you have any last comments? We got to wrap up here for the next training group here.
I feel like I learned a lot this session.
Good.
But other than that, no outstanding comments, no.
Okay, and John and Danielle have heard this ad nauseum, which is good, because they have to learn to teach this themselves too. So that's who arrived here. So John, Danielle, we've got Daniela, who you guys met down at Spark, and then Ian.
Yes, hi
joined.
John, hi Danielle, yes.
Hi Ian.
Hi.
They can't see us yet.
They can see on the stream if they're looking at the stream, but
I'm looking at the stream. I don't see us.
Oh, that's right. I don't have the other. Oh, it's the camera sagged.
I was like, I think I can wave
the
up
camera
here.
side.
No, the Reddit camera drew.
A little farther.
We ever find a cure?
Oh, I've met both of you, so I'm familiar. Yep. I can imagine.
So
I have
today
the visual.
is RPG Theory Day?
Yeah.
Okay, so you guys are welcome to leave or stay as you wish. This next session from 12 to 3 is, since it's RPG Theory Day, we will be doing a formal assessment, so activity assessment of a role-playing game. Right? That's what we had scheduled for today. So there's a specific methodology in recreation therapy and I didn't have time to update those notes to tweak it, so we'll have to kind of do that on the fly here. But there are specific assessments that you go through to break down and analyze how an activity works and what kind of considerations, adaptations you need to make. And so we did an introduction to this 2 weeks ago with a drum circle as an activity, because it was more, the activity was simpler than a role-playing game, so I was using it as a baseline to just introduce people to the concept of activity analysis. Now today we're going to try to do it with the basic D&D role-playing game, which is a simpler role-playing game than a lot of others that are out there. And
if we have time, we're going to go through others. And
then, if we have time to go through the others, I don't know if we will or won't, but over time, though, we are going to do this activity analysis of all the games that we use. Because over time, I want us to have written down in a spreadsheet, so we can do a cross-reference matrix, which role-playing game is a better match for which type of participant. That's the point of these activity analysis. Now, this is not as detailed as a task analysis. A task, and also, by the way, listening remotely is Kristen Strange as well. So she's hopefully going to join us. This is, I think she's the one down in Tucson who just joined as a researcher. So hopefully next week she'll be able to join through Jitsi. By the way, Jitsi's with an I at the end, not a Y. It's Jitsi, just so you know. So also joining is also on the staff, and will be joining through Jitsi in the near future. So we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Ian, I'm glad you learned lots. Danielle, I hope you found this useful. Remember, you have the option to come to the Tuesday one if you want, depending upon your schedule. You're not required. You only need to go to one per week. As you go through your self-study, right, you've got that checklist. Have you had any trouble getting access to that, Ian? You'll be able to go through that? You've got school and everything right now.
I've yet to start, but I have access, and I'm getting, as soon as I'm done with finals, I'm going to crank through some of that stuff.
Excellent, yeah. And a lot of it I still have to clean up and organize better, so you're going to see some of it still kind of a mess. But I'm working on it. So if you have questions on those, let me know. But it'll take you a little bit to get through the baseline.
Yeah.
So, but that way what I'm trying to do is have to repeat myself a little bit less each time and be able to move up forward with teaching people the more advanced stuff. And it's taking many iterations to get there, but we're getting there.
All right.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ian.
So again,
you too, Daniela.
You're welcome. If you want to stick around for the activity analysis, you're welcome. Otherwise, have a wonderful day. And I'm going to stop and start the stream, and then we'll be back, and we will be doing RPG theory session from 12 to 3, activity analysis of a role-playing game. Stay tuned.
Take care.
If you'd like.
Thank you.
See you.
Yeah. Have a good day, guys.
Take care.
Bye.